Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being with Henri Bergson, and the second part of this topic, life, preliminaries to life. Really, it's just life. I think I didn't need to say preliminaries, but anyway, second part of the video, let's just keep moving with this idea of life, kind of building up some of the fundamentals. So life proceeds for Bergson through two aspects. The first is inert matter, which resists the explosive force behind driving life forward. And the second is that explosive force, which is basically, as far as I can tell, the way he talks about it in Creative Evolution, that explosive force is that vital impulse, that élan vital, that we're going to look at in a couple of videos. So anyway, life proceeds through two aspects: inert matter, which resists this explosive force, and the explosive force itself. If we break down the explosive force a little bit, look at this. This is kind of where all the action happens, if you like, for life. So to understand this explosive force, this vital driving impulse within life, we need to look at individual lines of evolution. And that's really, it's a big part of what Creative Evolution, the book, is about. And it's quite, I mean, it's a good way to think about it. I think that if we want to understand life, we have to go back to looking at life, how it evolved, but we don't want to do it through the lens of biology. We don't want to know the details of each living creature. We want to understand the totality, how the whole thing fits together. And this is one of the strengths of Bergson, I think, is that he does go back to, he takes science, he uses science, he looks at psychology and sees the insights that are there, but he's looking at it from a big picture perspective. We look at biology, evolution, but not in order to break it down, to analyze the little bits and pieces, but to understand the whole, how the whole thing works. So we're going to look at individual lines of evolution. We're going to look at evolution itself in the next video. But for our purposes in this video, we still have to look at how life has evolved, kind of, again, bigger picture, if we want to understand this explosive force that drives life. So essentially, then we have two lines of evolution to follow: the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. Those are the two paths that evolution has traced out, or life has traced out. And between these two kingdoms, Bergson says there's no single distinguishing characteristic. Whatever you find in one, which you think might be essential to that group, there's evidence of it in members of the other group. You might think, movement, maybe the ability to move, but there are certain plants that move, have a limited capacity to move. Whatever any single point that we try to pick out, which differentiates plants and animals, eventually we find that it doesn't apply in all cases. So there's no single distinguishing characteristic, but there are two tendencies that each group emphasizes. So again, in a general sense. And these two tendencies are alimentation, ALI, so the way that members of these groups nourish themselves, and the second is movement. And in the first tendency here, alimentation, the difference is that plants make their own food. They have the means for their own nourishment within themselves. Animals, however, have to get their nourishment ultimately from plants. And the second tendency is movement. And clearly this is related to the first, plants, in that they make their own food. They don't have to go out and get it. They don't have to forage for it. So there's no drive for movement. There's no drive to locomotion. Whereas animals that obviously have to go out and search for their food, there is a strong evolutionary push for movement. And that movement, we've already talked about this when we looked at consciousness. This is an important part of consciousness. Movement, action, directed action, practical kind of awareness. These things develop into consciousness, which, awareness of self and environment for the individual, that these things they come along with the capacity to move, with you have to be able to discern different things in your environment. You have to be aware of yourself in relation to them. You have to, there's a lot going on there, which eventually in animals leads to consciousness. However, even this consciousness, Bergson's clear, there are no fixed differences between the animal and the plant kingdom, which isn't to say that plants are conscious. We're not going that far, really. But what he says is that consciousness and movement are sleeping in plants. So it's not that, animals are conscious, plants aren't, because under different circumstances, plants would evolve to, in a similar way, in a similar fashion to animals, so that consciousness can develop in plants. It's not that it's there now. This isn't panpsychism. But it's that it's kind of slumbering. There are no fixed differences between animals and plants. It's possible for plants to evolve, to develop consciousness under the right circumstances. And it's possible for animals to lose their consciousness, to revert back to a state of unconsciousness where, if movement is no longer a key factor in the individual's survival, if there's no drive anymore, there's no need anymore for a heightened awareness of self in relation to other things, of the environment, then that consciousness can slip back into a comatose state, into a state of slumber. So these aren't fixed distinctions between these two kingdoms. And this leads me to what I'm going to call in this video the first of a few key insights into life. And so we talked about that, the importance of movement and consciousness, the importance of freedom, indetermination, being a part of what it is to be conscious. And that leads to this first key insight, which is, at the root of life, there is an effort to engraft onto the necessity of physical forces the largest possible amount of indetermination. And we've talked about that quite a lot in the past, indetermination, how crucial that is for Bergson. Freedom, genuine freedom. It's built into kind of the metaphysical structure, but it also manifests at that higher level, that practical freedom that I called it. And that's crucial for Bergson's understanding of life. Life is, if we're trying to think about it, if we wanted to try and reduce it to one thing, perhaps, this effort to create indetermination, to break free from the necessity of physical forces, of cause and effect, which we see in conscious creatures, especially in ourselves, and perhaps, well, to differing degrees in other members of the animal kingdom. So this indetermination, then, this reservoir of indetermination, Bergson calls it, is secured in animals, in the nervous system, in the brain. So again, especially in humans, we see it. However, originally this effort to produce this reservoir of indetermination requires a store of energy which can be released at a moment. And so the way Bergson talks about this is that the problem here is how to secure an accumulation of potential energy that can be used by pulling a trigger. So kind of storing up this energy which can then be spent at once. That's what gets you to indetermination. That's kind of a prerequisite for genuine free action. You have to have the capacity to store up information. If you store up energy, if you can't do that, then you're restricted to just cause and effect. Action and stimulus. Stimulus and action. Stimulus and reaction. Let's say that. Stimulus response. Okay, finally, that's the one I was looking for. Because you've got there's no capacity from which you can, from which it's possible to create a free movement, a free action. So we need that, and that happens. That source of energy is from the sun. The plants store that energy through photosynthesis and so on, and animals are able to make use of it. That's basically the idea here. So that's how we're able to secure this capacity to act freely, to act with indetermination. And so there is a harmony between the plant and the animal kingdoms. The plants store that energy for us. They are able to accumulate it, and we're able to take it from them, to use up that energy, to assimilate it, and to then which lets us, which gives us the ability to expend it by pulling a trigger at a moment's notice. So that harmony between the two kingdoms, but since indeterminate action is the goal of life, we talked about that the root of life is this effort to secure the largest possible amount of indetermination. Since that's the case, the animal over the plant represents the main direction of life. That's where we're going to have to focus if we want to understand life, because that's where we see this freedom, this indetermination come to fruition. And so that's what we're going to look at now, the animal kingdom. So we've seen that the main thing here with animals, and one of the focuses of all of Bergson's philosophy when it comes to humans in particular, is movement, action. That's so fundamental. Fundamentally, we are engaged practically in the world, in our surroundings, and that just features again here when we think about evolution, when we think about life. The animal kingdom is all about movement or action, and in fact, he says the whole organism. When we look at the biology, the whole organism seems to support this sensory motor system that Bergson's talked about so much. So much of what we are as living organisms is directed towards maintaining that. Is directed towards practical competence in our environment, towards locomotion, to moving to places, to getting to things, to grasping objects, to using them. And that, like I said, that's a theme that we've seen again and again, and it comes out here when we look at the organism itself, and even when you think most of the glucose maybe is used by the brain, but even then, it's tempting to think, so we're all rational creatures first and foremost. We're all cognitive, thinking, intellectual beings first and foremost. But actually, most of it's used by the brain. But to do what? To function in the world, to direct our bodies, to gauge distances, to do all of these practical things, to support this sensory motor system that is us, that is our bodies. And this biological fact, makes sense if the goal of life is indetermination. If the goal is to create this system in which there is free choice, in which there is the greatest amount of freedom, free action possible, as we've been talking about. If at the root of life there is this effort to engraft onto the necessity of physical forces the largest possible amount of indetermination. If that's true, then this bias that our bodies seem to have for the sensory motor system, to maintaining the sensory motor system, the muscles, the functioning of the muscles, the awareness that we have of our spatiotemporal location, of our spatial awareness in our environments and those kinds of things. That all makes sense if, as Bergson says, the goal is free action, to generate, to create a source of free action. Again, of course, not in a teleological sense. There's no need to invoke that here. And I think we will discuss that a little bit later, but at the moment all we're talking about is this: what is the force of life here? What is it doing if we look at instances, examples, individual cases from the animal kingdom, a branch of evolution. And so he looks at some different branches within the animal kingdom itself. He looks at mollusks and echinoderms, but he says so mollusks, but not squid or snails, and echinoderms, things like starfish. And he says that these branches have renounced consciousness. They haven't followed through on that. They've renounced consciousness, they've renounced movement, and therefore they've renounced the thrust of life itself. Life is moving in that direction, towards movement, towards awareness, towards consciousness, and any branches of evolution that don't go in that direction are evolutionary dead ends for Bergson, for our understanding of life. And again, this is this isn't a dogmatic thing. You can't point to this and say, oh, hold on, starfish move though, so they haven't renounced movement. That's beside the point. The point is, what's important is any creature, any branch of evolution that has renounced movement, that doesn't need to move, that doesn't need to be aware of its surroundings, that hasn't progressed down the path that life wants to go. And Bergson thought starfish fell into that category. If they don't, that's fine, we can take them out of that category. But what's important is the underlying idea. That's why I find Bergson quite interesting, because he relies on science, he uses science, but his philosophy isn't dependent on his scientific conclusions. He has his philosophy, although it accords with science, the things that the reasons for his beliefs and his propositions are what's important. So even if the science changes, which it will, right? Even if we make new discoveries in the future, which we absolutely will, it doesn't affect the underlying philosophy that Bergson has here. And if it did, it would just be bad philosophy, right? If your philosophy could be shown to be false through a future discovery, a scientific discovery, then it wasn't particularly philosophical in the first place. It was more scientific. So everything that I'm saying here, when I say mollusks or echinoderms or arthropods or whatever, what's important is not those categories. It's the underlying reasons behind why Bergson's dividing them up in this way. So mollusks and echinoderms, they've renounced consciousness and movement. Arthropods, on the other hand, so insects, are very much part of, they very much haven't renounced consciousness and movement, right? They're all over the place, getting up to all sorts of mischief. But they are instinct. They're driven by instinct, which we've already looked at. So what's characteristic of arthropods is the knowledge of how to use organized tools. And by organized tools, Bergson means how to use parts of its body to accomplish functions, to accomplish its goals. Which we've talked about in quite a bit of detail. The advantage of this, of course, perfectly specialized, these things, and immediately useful. If your body is the tool, then it's evolved to perform this, whatever task it is, exceptionally well in most cases, because that's just how evolution works, right? It hones it hones the organism itself, and so if the organism itself is the tool, that tool also becomes further refined and honed. The disadvantage of this, of course, is that it's limited. It's only good for that job, and there's no way to take that tool, which is the body, and use it for something else. There isn't even the capacity to think of that, to imagine doing that. So that's the instinct branch. And then there are the vertebrates, which is the branch of intelligence. And the knowledge that's dominant here is, instead of how to use organized tools, it's how to make unorganized tools. So it's the capacity to, we don't have that many tools ourselves. Our bodies aren't honed as specialist tools for any particular job, but we're able to make tools from things around us. That's what Bergson means by unorganized. And the advantage, of course, wide scope. We can make tools to do different things. We can identify different needs. We can identify different ways of accomplishing our desired goals, and apply ourselves to making those tools, which will allow us to do that. And the disadvantage, of course, is that it's imperfect. So we may not stumble on, we may not happen across or be able to come up with the right tool for the job. And this requires a significant amount of effort. But an interesting consequence of this is that intelligence opens new fields of possibilities. For every need that it satisfies, it creates a new need. And so instead of closing like instinct, the round of action within which the animal tends to move automatically, it lays open to activity an unlimited field into which it is driven further and further and made more and more free. So that capacity, this is quite a nice idea, just having that capacity to make tools, that in and of itself, that might only be the very most rudimentary form of indetermination, of freedom. But that having that capacity leads to further freedoms. It continues to broaden the scope, because we use our freedom to create one tool, but that tool then opens a whole new vista, and then we can continue to explore that. Freedoms build upon freedoms, so it's like a self-reinforcing tendency. And so if we compare these two branches, so these are the two most important branches for Bergson, instinct and intelligence, arthropods and the vertebrates. For consciousness, since consciousness is the light that plays around the zone of possible actions, we've talked about that, I think almost that exact same quote before. That's what tying consciousness into, again, freedom and movement and the awareness of ourselves and our environments. Since consciousness is this light that plays around the zone of possible actions, intelligence, in as much as it enhances this zone, will lead towards consciousness, while instinct leads towards unconsciousness. So that's the first distinction. Consciousness tends towards intelligence tends towards consciousness, instinct tends towards unconsciousness. But that's not the main distinction for Bergson here between instinct and intelligence. The main distinction between these two groups is knowledge, kind of knowledge that they both have. So he talks about instinct here, instinct knowing definite objects. That's what it knows. And an example would be from a few videos ago, we talked about the wasp, which has to immobilize a particular ant or something, an insect. It knows that insect. That's all it knows, though. The bee knows the flower. Those are the things that they have knowledge of, definite objects. So it's knowledge of a matter that's important here. And it says, this is. So it's a categorical form of knowledge. As opposed to intelligence, which knows, instead of objects, it knows relations. So things like cause and effect, like to like. It's aware of these connecting threads between the objects. So this is, instead of knowledge of a matter, knowledge of a form. And it says, if such and such, then such and such. So this kind of knowledge is hypothetical. And so that's the main difference for Bergson between instinct and intelligence. Kinds of knowledge that they both, members of both groups have. And this brings me to another key insight. A lot of this is not particularly revolutionary, right? A lot of this stuff is not earth-shaking stuff, but it's kind of when you take all of these ideas together and kind of synthesize them into a philosophy like Bergson has done. That's when I think that's where the magic happens for me, anyway. So it's like just taking these kind of almost common sense ideas and just being able to fit them together in such a way that we get a system, a philosophy, a metaphysics that I think really is quite different from the way that we normally think about things, which is interesting, to take things that we all accept readily and easily and draw quite different conclusions from them. That to me is kind of the genius of Bergson here. So the key insight that we go to next is, or that this leads Bergson to next, is the difference between animals and humans. And this difference is then a difference of kind, not degree. So we've just looked at two branches of the animal. We've looked at plants and animals, then we've focused on animals, and we looked at the branches of animals that lack movement, that have no consciousness, that are more like plants than animals. And then we've got these other two branches, instinct and intelligence, and we're going to see how humans alone, and again, this isn't dogmatic. If we have to adjust that category later, if we have to include the great apes or the dolphins or whatever, that's fine. We can do that. But the difference at the moment, we can safely say, between animals, the rest of the animal kingdom, and humans, is a difference for Bergson of kind, not of degree. How can we help being struck by the fact that while man is capable of learning any sort of exercise, of constructing any sort of object, in short, of acquiring any kind of motor habit whatsoever, the faculty of combining new movements is strictly limited in the best endowed animal, even in the ape? The human brain is made, like every brain, to set up motor mechanisms and to enable us to choose among them at any instant the one we shall put in motion by the pull of a trigger. But it differs from other brains in this, that the number of mechanisms it can set up, and consequently the choice that it gives as to which among them shall be released, is unlimited. Now, from the limited to the unlimited, there is all the distance between the closed and the open. It is not a difference of degree, but of kind. That is a fantastic way to think about this, I think. Because, we tend to see a continuum between, and I mean, this is not the way it used to be, right? We used to be divinely special. Bergson is definitely not arguing for that. But there is still a difference of kind, not degree. We're in renouncing the religious input into these debates. We've kind of gone too far the other way and said, okay, well now, they used to say that we were special, we were divinely chosen, we had a spark of the divine in us. Now we don't want any of that. Now we're just animals like all other animals. There's nothing special about us. But it's just gone too far the other way. Clearly that we are different. But it doesn't mean that we have been chosen, or it doesn't mean that we are essentially different. And it doesn't mean that the door is closed to other animals. Other animals can make that same leap that we have. But if they do, then they will join this exclusive group, which is a difference in kind from what they used to be. Because, as Bergson says, it's now they've gone from having limited options, those limited set of mechanisms to call on, to now having an unlimited set. And the difference between the limited and the unlimited is not a difference of degree. By increasing a limited quantity of something, you'll never get to an unlimited quantity. And that's the idea that Bergson's saying here. More limited something will never get you unlimited, so the two categories are completely different. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't go from one to the other. You can, but you get there through a leap. You don't get there through incremental steps. So I like that, and it goes against a lot of it goes against all of our science, right? All of our biology. We're just animals. But I've been dissatisfied with that picture for a while now. And I used to listen to Sam Harris a lot, and I always remember him saying, we are basically chimps in suits or something, apes in suits, apes in clothes or something like that. That was how he would talk about humans. But it's obviously that's not true. There is an obvious sense in which we are completely different from even apes. And to just gloss over it by saying we're apes in suits, that's ridiculous. It's just it completely misses a fundamental truth, I think. So Bergson goes on to say that animals do exhibit choice, but invention is never anything but a variation on the theme of routine. Shut up in the habits of the species, it succeeds, no doubt, in enlarging them by its individual initiative, but it escapes automatism only for an instant, for just the time to create a new automatism. The gates of its prison close as soon as they are opened. By pulling at its chain, it succeeds only in stretching it. With man, consciousness breaks the chain. In man and in man alone, it sets itself free. And that's great. That's a great little quote there, I think. And we've talked about this before in Time and Free Will. There's a very similar quote, I think. The gates of its prison close as soon as they're opened. And we tend to, it's kind of funny actually, we tend to promote animals. We tend to bias ourselves to see more in animals than is really there. So we look at the learning behavior of chimps and things, and the social behavior that they exhibit in dolphins and things, and how they learn. But their learning, it's nothing like the way that we learn. It's nothing like as close to. It's not even close to the systematic way that we learn, that we teach. It's more like imitation. They learn by imitation, which is not to say that that's not a starting point. It is the starting point. But the difference between that and what we do when we're learning, when we're teaching, when we're educating, that the difference between the two is a difference of kind, not a difference of degree. So I really like that idea. And that's the flip side of that. We elevate animals and tend to diminish our own capacities in order to kind of find the middle ground, to meet in the middle somewhere. So we're exactly the same. There's no difference between. We're just chimps in suits. That's all. Chimps, we just kind of push them up a little bit, knock ourselves down, and then we come to this medium. And so now it's almost politically incorrect to say we're different from animals, or speciesism, or it's not about that. It's just about acknowledging the obvious. We're different in kind from other animals, which again doesn't mean that they can't make the same leap. Any life form can make that same leap. We're not divine. We haven't been, the spark of the divine hasn't been breathed into us by a god or anything. We don't have to go down that path. Any living organism can make that leap, but that's what it is. It's a leap. It's not a step-by-step progression, because you can't go from step-by-step from the limited. You can't progress step-by-step to the unlimited. There has to be a fundamental change, such that what you were before and what you are now are two completely different kinds of things. Okay, nice. And this then leads to another key insight, which will almost certainly ruffle a few feathers. Bergson says that in this sense, and in this sense only, humanity is the term and the end of evolution. So it's like we are the peak, the pinnacle of evolution. And there's all manner of, and again, this is largely a resistance to religion, which placed us on a pedestal, a divine pedestal, which was wrong. but they had it right, and at least that they understood that, or they believed that we are fundamentally different. We're a difference in kind, not a difference in degree. And in this sense, the sense that this is what life is about. Life is driving towards ever more indetermination. It's driving towards freedom, more options. In that sense, humanity is the end of evolution, which doesn't mean that evolution stops at humanity. Obviously, it will keep progressing. We haven't ended evolution in that sense of the term. And obviously it's not teleological. Evolution didn't have us in mind. It didn't have to end up with humans. And it may not only be humans. Other planets, there may have evolved other life forms that are conscious. Maybe even here, if we might have to revise that assessment later if although it doesn't look like it at the moment, but if it turns out that chimps are, we have to acknowledge that they're more intelligent than we think, or if some years into the future, they manage to make that leap, then by all means, they become part of that group. They become the end of evolution as well, in the same way that we are. So it's not speciesist in that sense. It's more that it's the underlying idea. It's not that there's something special about humans. It's that what we've done is special. And any other animal species can do that as well. And a good analogy that Bergson has for this is, he says that life is like a wave spreading out from a single point, a central point, and it's stopped at every point on its circumference, except that one place where that impulsion, that vital impulse, that driving force of life passes freely. Everywhere but in man, consciousness has had to come to a stand. In man alone, it has kept on its way. Man, then, continues the vital movement indefinitely. And so man, humanity, right? Bergson was writing in the early 20th century. And so I quite like that analogy. It's nice that if we imagine life kind of expanding from a central point, and it just kind of meets roadblocks everywhere along the circumference, except at this point where evolution has been able to push through on into consciousness, through movement, the necessity of movement, of action, of having to have that awareness. All of that has culminated in consciousness, which is free, fundamentally free. And being that is the goal in a non-teleological sense of life, then that is, in that sense and in that sense only, humanity is the end of evolution. End in inverted commas, I should note. Again, Bergson doesn't mean that evolution stops at humanity. So with everything that we've said, there are a couple more key insights I want to make. The first one is that this vital impulsion of life is divided into three elements in Bergson: vegetative torpor, instinct, and intelligence. And there's a nice quote here to go along with this. The cardinal error which from Aristotle onwards has vitiated most of the philosophies of nature is to see in vegetative, instinctive, and rational life three successive degrees of the development of one and the same tendency, whereas they are three divergent directions of an activity that has split up as it grew. The difference between them is not a difference of intensity, nor more generally of degree, but of kind. Just circling back to that idea. those three features have been known, have been discussed since Aristotle, but everybody has seen them as on a continuum, whereas Bergson sees them as divergent branches. So there's still a driving force in the background or underneath, but they're not the same things. They're not steps on a ladder going higher. You don't start with vegetative torpor, then go to instinct, then go to intelligence, and then do you go on further? I don't know. But those three things are not on the same ladder. They're three different ladders. That original force, that driving force, has kind of branched out into three distinct. It's branched out into three ladders. That's not a very good analogy. But one ladder kind of stops. It doesn't go all the way. The second ladder goes higher, but it still doesn't go all the way. The third ladder gets to the top, as far as we know, which is intelligence, which has opened up the maximum amount of indetermination possible. And so, the important point is those three ladders are separate ladders. They're not rungs on the same ladder. So life proceeded, again, in order to promote freedom, indeterminism, by dividing itself into animals and vegetables, then instinct and intelligence. And only in the sudden leap from animal to human did the brain hold other motor habits in check, and thereby, in overcoming automatism, set consciousness free. And so, yeah, again, just everything ties in with movement, with freedom, life, consciousness. It's all kind of worked in for Bergson here, which is really one of the appeals of his philosophy for me. It's just so fertile, you know. I mean, what are we? Video 16, you know, and this is just trying to capture everything that he talked about. It boils down to some fundamental, some basic ideas. Duration. It boils down to duration, really, but there's just so much that flows from that key insight. And Bergson has said this. He says this in The Creative Mind. I think I might have said this before. Every good philosopher has only one good idea, and they spend the rest of their career trying to explain that idea, because the idea is something that's captured in intuition, and then you have to try and explain it. You have to try and convey it in words and concepts, which are always going to be inadequate. So you've always got to refine your definition, your description. And on top of that, there's just so many things that duration explains, that Bergson uses duration to, that fundamental insight, that fundamental intuition to, he's able to pull so many things into it. Just a really great a masterclass in philosophy. Don't like that expression, but just good philosophizing here, I think. Anyway, this leads to the last key insight I want to make here. This idea that there are life branches into three distinct categories, which are different in kind, not degree: vegetative torpor, instinct, and intelligence, sets up this last key insight. Life does not proceed by the association and addition of elements, but by dissociation and division. Another great idea. Life doesn't build on itself. It's not this continual movement forward. Rather, it works by separation, dissociating, dividing. That's the fundamental force here. And again, kind of different to the way that we tend to think about it in our scientific biology focused era. It's, we tend to see things we tend to think in terms of accumulations, additions, building on what came before. But for Bergson, it's the exact opposite. Life proceeds by dissociation and division. So the original impetus, then this driving force of life, combines all the features we've discussed here: storage of energy, that explosive release in instinct and in intelligence especially. But it must have been limited in the sense that it needed to split up these things in order to progress. So everything was kind of together at one stage in this, and all of the ingredients were there in this impetus, in this driving force of life, but it couldn't continue. It couldn't progress. There was some obstacle to it, to life evolving with all of those ingredients together. So it had to break up. And in breaking up and making itself, in a sense, making itself less, what was together, what was whole, has had to break up. But in doing so, it let one branch continue further towards its goal, which is that engrafting indetermination onto the necessity of physical forces. So you break up. It's all together. The capacity to store energy and to release it at the pull of a trigger was in the same maybe organism. Maybe is the way to think about it. It was in the same organism. It was there together in one individual, but there was some limiting factor. For some reason we don't know, it was unable to proceed to further the amount of indetermination that's there. So it had to break up. So it branched out. Now you have storage over here, but the capacity to use it over here. But that meant that this one could continue. This branch could continue further in that direction. Same thing as the animal kingdom. You've got instinct and intelligence. Originally it was together. But for Bergson, dissociation is the name of the game. So it had to, for some reason, there was an obstacle. It couldn't continue when instinct and intelligence were combined, when the tool was the body, and having the capacity to create. It didn't fit. They couldn't work together. Evolution had to break it up. So now you've broken up instinct and intelligence. You've got the capacity to make, and the specialist tools for the job over here, and this branch is able to continue on. And so that's the way that life progresses for Bergson, rather than this building on top of what came before. It's a breaking up of what came before. Really. For me, anyway, it's a really unique idea, which I had never thought of before. But when I read it in Creative Evolution, it just sounds so plausible. It seems like he's really hit the nail on the head with that, and it goes kind of against, like I say, the way that we tend to think. But there is definitely something appealing about it. And I want to finish with a definition, a kind of definition. Well, after all of this is kind of taken into account, at some point in creative evolution, Bergson says life is reciprocal and interpenetration, endlessly continued creation. So at its broadest, that would be the broadest kind of definition you might want to give to life. And it will not escape your attention that is precisely the definition of duration. Reciprocal interpenetration, endlessly continued creation. And so, like I said before, everything just finds its home in duration, and everything kind of flows from that, which is magic. Let's hit a summary. So first of all, we looked at life having two aspects, inert matter and this explosive force. Then we looked at, we drilled down on the explosive force a little bit, saw that it broke up into plants and animals, and within the animal kingdom we could further break that up into instinct and intelligence. And the key insights that I was able to extract from creative evolution concerning life, the goal of life is indetermination. That's the fundamental drive here, to not in a teleological sense, not even in a conscious sense. It's just that's what life is. It's this drive to create opportunities, to create genuine new pathways, to create indetermination. Second insight, the difference between animals and humans is a difference of kind, not of degree. The third insight was that humanity is the end of evolution. And I've already issued enough caveats with that I don't think I need to say anything more concerning that controversial statement. The fourth key insight, the vital impulsion is divided into three elements: the vegetative, the instinct, and intelligence. And the fifth insight, building on that, life proceeds by dissociation or division, not association and addition. And it proceeds by breaking up in order to continue further down one track. There's some obstacle, some limiting factor, and the only way to overcome that is to branch out, to break up, not to into something, not to create something which naturally follows on from what came before, but to create two fundamentally different kinds of thing. That's how life proceeds for Bergson. And that final definition, which I couldn't resist throwing in, life is reciprocal interpenetration, endlessly continued creation, and we linked that with duration. Okay, so that is quite a bit about life. The next video we'll look at evolution, and then in the video after that we're going to want to bring it back to try and flesh out this idea of the élan vital a little bit more. What is this vital impulse? Anyway, and that's the path from here. Thanks for listening. I hope this helped a little bit, and I'll see you in the next video.